Atari is a legendary video game company founded in 1972. It once was a household name in the video game industry and pioneered console gaming. But how have Atari consoles evolved throughout the years? This is the evolution of Atari. Nothing brings back good old memories like the Atari consoles. For the first time, people could enjoy their favorite arcade games, including brand new ones from the comfort of their homes. It all started in 1971, when Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney founded a small company named ScHlAuChi Engineering. These two men became friends when they found out they had common interests in electronic games. Together, they created a game called Computer Space, which became the world's first commercially available arcade video game. It could be played in a large custom fiberglass cabinet, which Nolan Bushnell designed so as to look futuristic. After discovering that another company had the same name, they changed their name to Atari. Although Atari is widely recognized as the pioneer of home video game consoles, Magnavox released the world's first home video game console in 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey. In fact, one of their games inspired Atari to produce their first commercially successful video game. In 1972, Atari developed an iconic arcade game named Pong. Bushnell and Dabney needed a design engineer and convinced Al Alcorn, whom they already knew from previous work experience. Although Alcorn was an intelligent electrical engineer, he had no experience with video games. This was a concern because Bushnell and Dabney wanted to create a driving game, which they thought might be too complicated for Alcorn's first game design. However, Bushnell had seen the Magnavox Odyssey's tennis game and thought it would be great if Alcorn would create a similar game. So that's what Alcorn did, and the two founders were surprised by the quality of Alcorn's work. They dropped the idea for a driving game and continued with Alcorn's design to create Pong. Pong was the first commercially successful video game and helped to establish the video game industry along with the Magnavox Odyssey.
Odyssey, the electronic game of the future that lets you do your own thing on television.
During the 1975 Christmas season, Atari released a console for the game Pong, called Home Pong. Chips for home consoles had only recently become available. Initial development cost for a game on a single LSI chip cost about $50,000, which is equivalent to $325,000 today. Luckily, once the chip was further developed and could be mass-produced, it became significantly cheaper. Home Pong became a commercial success and over 150,000 units were sold. Fun fact, Magnavox filed a lawsuit against Atari. They argued that Atari had infringed the patents of their table tennis game and demonstrated that Bushnell had even played the game before releasing Pong. Bushnell later stated, quote, "The fact is that I absolutely did see the Odyssey game, and I didn't think it was very clever." According to their lawyer, Atari could have won the lawsuit. However, he estimated that the legal costs would amount to $1.5 million. This exceeded Atari's funds, so they decided to settle. Eventually, Atari had to pay $1.5 million to Magnavox in 8 installments. This video is sponsored by IVACY VPN. The digital world can be a dangerous place, and while you browse the web, you have no idea who may be watching you and what their intentions are. IVACY VPN ensures your anonymity, secures public Wi-Fi networks, and prevents tracking and cyber attacks. But one of the greatest features why I personally use IVACY VPN is the ability to watch Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney from anywhere in the world without being restricted to the titles in my country. Normally, I can't watch Harry Potter on Netflix, but thanks to the magic of IVACY VPN, I can change my location to Australia and watch all the Harry Potter movies. IVACY VPN is also awarded for best speed and supports all major platforms. For Black Friday, you can get a huge 90% discount on the 5-year plan. This means you can get it for just $60, which is only $1 a month. Get your Black Friday deal right now by clicking the link in the description. Due to the success of Home Pong and the Magnavox Odyssey, Other competitors also tried to create home consoles. One of the competitors created a console called the Channel F, which became the first video game to use ROM cartridges instead of having games built in. Atari also wanted to create a home console with ROM cartridges and released the Atari 2600 in 1977. At the launch, it was sold for $199, which may not sound like a lot, but today that would be equivalent to $890. It came with 2 joystick controllers, 2 paddle controllers, and a game cartridge. Initially, it came with the game Combat, and later with one of the most famous games in the world, Pac-Man. However, Pac-Man barely resembled the original, and consumers were upset. Atari is thought to have been left with approximately 5 million unwanted copies of the game. Nowadays, kids grow up with the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X and might wonder why anyone could be excited with an Atari console. But at the time, these colorful graphics and improved sound were a big deal. Many successful titles were released, including Space Invaders, Pitfall, and Nintendo's Donkey Kong. The Atari 2600 became a massive success. More than 30 million units were sold. In fact, it was so successful that the name Atari almost became synonymous with video games in general. Fun fact: Atari implemented a risky pricing strategy for the Atari 2600. They lost money on the consoles, but hoped to earn that money back by selling games at a premium. The risk paid off, and it revolutionized the pricing strategy for consoles. Both Sony and Microsoft use this strategy today and lose money on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. In 1979, Atari introduced its first 8-bit home computers, the Atari 400 and Atari 800. At that time, Bushnell had already sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million, and the new CEO of the company was Ray Kasser. Kasser saw an opportunity to make money in the home computer era that had just began. He wanted to challenge Apple, who had just launched the Apple II home computer. Multiple games were released for the 8-bit home computers, including Pac-Man, Pitfall, Donkey Kong, and River Raid. Home computers weren't cheap. The Atari 400 was sold for $550 at launch, which would be equivalent to $2,000 today. Oh, and the Atari 400 was the cheaper model. The Atari 800 had a price tag of $1,000, which would be about $3,700 today. In total, Atari managed to sell an impressive 4 million units of the 8-bit home computers. In 1982, Atari released their next-generation console, the Atari 5200. The CPU and graphics were almost identical to the Atari 8-bit computers. The Atari 5200 had a controller with an analog joystick, a numeric keypad, and start, pause, and reset buttons. In total, only 69 games were released for the console, while the Atari 2600 has 528 games. Games that players could enjoy on the Atari 5200 were Miss Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Hero. But then the video game industry was hit by the video game crash of 1983, also known as the Atari shock in Japan. Revenues of the video game industry peaked at around $3.2 billion, then fell massively to around $100 million by 1985. That is a drop of almost 97%. Atari was losing millions of dollars a day, and Warner Communications became desperate to sell off the division. To make things even worse, Nintendo released the Famicom in 1983. This quickly became a major competitor, mainly due to its incredible games like The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, and Super Mario Bros. The Atari 5200 became a failure. Only 1 million units were sold, compared to its predecessor's sales of over 30 million. Fun fact: Nintendo and Atari discussed the possibility of the two companies working together to launch the Famicom in North America. Nintendo offered Atari the opportunity to sell the Famicom under its own brand in exchange for paying Nintendo a royalty on every console. However, the deal was never signed, and Nintendo would eventually take over the reputation that Atari once had in the video game industry. The Atari 7800 was released in 1986, and it was the first console with backward compatibility. This meant that players could enjoy almost all Atari 2600 games, which many players have been begging for. Surprisingly, the Atari 7800 was released with a different version for Europe that even had a different controller. In an effort to prevent the flood of poor quality games that contributed to the video game crash of 1983, all new games had to be digitally signed by Atari. Some of these games include Pole Position 2, Kung Fu Master, Desert Falcon, and players could enjoy a few Nintendo titles like Donkey Kong Jr. and Mario Brothers. Unlike its predecessor, the Atari 7800 was profitable and 3.8 million units were sold. In 1989, Atari launched the world's first handheld game console with a color LCD screen, the Atari Lynx. This console was designed by Epyx, but they lacked the financial means needed to produce it. Epyx had also tried to partner with Sega and Nintendo, but both declined. But the partnership with Atari didn't last long, as Epyx declared bankruptcy by the end of the year. The major competitor of the Atari Lynx was the Nintendo Game Boy, released just a few months earlier. The Game Boy was much cheaper, and it had a better battery life. Games released for the Atari Lynx were Rampart, Lemmings, Blue Lightning, and Miss Pac-Man. Atari only managed to sell 3 million units, while Nintendo sold a whopping 118.7 million units of the Game Boy. In 1993, Atari launched the Atari Jaguar. The team that developed the Atari Jaguar claimed they could make a console superior to Sega Genesis and SNES. Excited by this claim, Atari contacted them to build the Jaguar console. However, the Atari Jaguar was sold for $250, while the SNES had a launch price of $200, and the Sega Genesis was sold for even less, namely $190. And to make things worse, only 50 games were released for the Jaguar in total. That is about 35 times less than all the games that were released for the SNES. Games that owners of the Jaguar could play were Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure, Wolfenstein 3D, Rayman, and Doom. Atari made a CD-ROM peripheral named the Jaguar CD. Only 12 CD games were released during its lifetime. In total, only 150,000 units of the Jaguar were sold, making it by far the worst-selling console they had ever made. Meanwhile, Sega sold 30.7 million units of the Genesis, and Nintendo sold 49.1 million units of the SNES. This massive commercial failure led to Atari leaving the console market, at least for a while. In 2004, Atari released the Atari Flashback, a console that resembles a smaller version of the Atari 7800. It was sold for $45 at launch. It features 20 built-in games, including 15 Atari 2600 and 5 Atari 7800 games. Approximately 500,000 units of the Atari Flashback were sold. The Atari Flashback 2 was released in 2005. It was an improved version that had more games. In the United States alone, 860,000 units were sold. Atari made many more Flashback units, with the latest version being the Atari Flashback X that was released in 2019. The basic model includes 2 wired controllers and an impressive 110 games. In 2020, Atari released their latest console, which is the Atari VCS. It has a lot of streaming apps, a streaming service, Atari games, and the console allows users to download and install other games, including those compatible with Windows 10. The Atari VCS isn't cheap though, as it was sold for $299 at launch for just the system, or $399 with 2 controllers combined. Fun fact, Atari made their own cryptocurrency named the Atari Token. Its primary focus is to be integrated as an in-game currency and offers gamers a means of payment. In 2021, Atari is still active and has created many games, including Pong Quest, Missile Command Recharged, and many Roller Coaster Tycoon games. While Atari no longer is the gaming giant it once was, it did pioneer console gaming and helped to shape the gaming industry. Animations like this require a lot of time and effort, so please subscribe. Thank you.